close your eyes and imagine this. Paris, the city of light, the city of love, the city where croissant costs more than your first car. But let's rewind about 2,300 years, because Paris wasn't always a sophisticated entity judging your choice of sneakers. Around 250 BC, a Celtic tribe called the Parisian decided that a swampy island in the middle of a river was prime real estate. And you know what? They were kind of right. This island, now called Isle de la Cite, became the birthplace of Paris. The Parisian were basically ancient hipsters, claiming a neighborhood before it was cool. They fished, they traded, they probably argued about the best way to make whatever the Celtic equivalent of coffee was. Fast forward to 52 BC, and the Romans show up like that friend who invites himself to dinner and never leaves. Julius Caesar's forces conquered the area, and suddenly the Parisian found themselves living in Lutetia, which, if we're being honest, sounds like a prescription medication. Ask your doctor if Lutetia is right for you. The Romans did what Romans do. They built baths, temples, and an amphitheater that could seat 15,000 people. Because apparently, ancient entertainment required stadium seating. The Roman settlement stretched beyond the island to the left bank, where they constructed those elaborate public baths at what's now the Cluny Museum. Romans really loved their baths. Really loved them. It was basically their version of Netflix and chill, except it was baths and philosophy. Then Christianity arrived in the 3rd century A.D., brought by Saint Denis, who was one of the more metal origin stories in religious history. According to legend, after being beheaded on Montmartre, which literally means Mount of Martyrs, so, spoiler alert, he picked up his own head and walked 6 miles while preaching a sermon, which is either incredibly miraculous or suggests the Romans needed to work on their beheading technique. By the 4th century, Lutetia was officially being called Paris again. The Parisian name stuck, proving that you can conquer a people, but you can't always rebrand their city. It's like when corporations try to make fetch happen. In 451 AD, Attila the Hun was heading toward Paris, and everyone panicked. Enter Saint Genevieve, a young nun who basically told everyone to calm down and pray instead of fleeing. Attila inexplicably changed direction and spared the city. Genevieve became Paris's patron saint, which is a nice retirement plan for successfully predicting a warlord's GPS malfunction. The Roman Empire crumbled like a croissant left out overnight, and in 486 AD, Clovis, king of the Franks, made Paris his capital. This is a big deal because the Franks would eventually give their name to France. So, basically, France is named after the Franks, and Paris was their headquarters. It's like naming your company after your office building. Clovis converted to Christianity, which was politically convenient and spiritually significant, depending on who you ask. He built a church dedicated to Saints Peter and Paul on the left bank, which later became the Abbey of St. Genevieve. Medieval people really loved naming things after saints. It was like their version of naming everything tech or digital. The city was still relatively small, mostly confined to the Isle de la Cite and parts of the left bank. The right bank was marshy, flood-prone, and generally considered the part of town where you didn't want to buy property. Basically, it was every city's up-and-coming neighborhood that takes another 500 years to actually come up. And that's how Paris began. From Celtic fishermen to Roman spa enthusiasts to Frankish kings, all arguing over a muddy island and a river. If you're still awake, don't worry. We got about 1,500 more years to cover, and it gets even weirder. The Middle Ages in Paris were called dark, partly because of the lack of street lighting, but mostly because hygiene was considered optional and everyone just threw their garbage into the street. Imagine your worst roommate. Multiply by 100,000 and you've got medieval Paris. By the 800s, Vikings discovered Paris the way tourists do today. By boat, except instead of taking photos, they pillaged. Between 845 and 886 AD, Norse raiders attacked Paris multiple times, rowing up the Seine like the world's worst river cruise. The 885 siege lasted nearly a year, with Parisians holding out on their island fortress. Eventually, the Frankish king paid the Vikings to leave, invented a concept of paying ransomware about 1,100 years before computers. In 987 AD, Hugh Capet became king of France and made Paris his permanent seat of power. The Capetian dynasty would rule France for over 300 years, which is an impressive run by any standard. It's like if a TV show actually stayed good past season 3. Notre Dame Cathedral began construction in 1163 under Bishop Maurice de Sully, who apparently woke up one day and said, "You know what this island needs? A building that takes 200 years to complete." The cathedral was finished in 1345, meaning generations of Parisians were born, lived, and died while listening to construction noise. Medieval urban living at its finest. King Philip II, also known as Philip Augustus, because one name wasn't pretentious enough, ruled from 1180 to 1223 and actually did some useful things. He paved the main streets of Paris, which was revolutionary because previously the streets were just artistic arrangements of mud and horse manure. He also built walls around the city and constructed the Louvre, not as a museum, mind you, but as a fortress to store his stuff and intimidate his enemies. It was basically a very aggressive storage unit. The University of Paris was officially recognized in 1200, growing out of the cathedral schools. It became one of Europe's leading centers of learning, particularly in theology and philosophy. Students came from across Europe to argue about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, which was considered a legitimate academic debate. The left bank became the Latin Quarter, because lectures were in Latin, making it the original place where you had no idea what anyone was saying. In 1163, the Les Halles market was established, becoming Paris's central food market for over 800 years. It was basically medieval Whole Foods, except with more questionable meat and fewer kombucha options. Parisians took their food seriously even then, which explains a lot about modern French cuisine. Philippe IV, known as Philip the Fair, presumably for his looks, not his personality, moved against the Knights Templar in 1307. He arrested, tortured, and eventually executed the Templars, seizing their wealth because apparently being king of France didn't pay as well as you'd think. Their Paris headquarters, the Temple, became a prison. Nothing says stable government like turning your warrior monk's fortress into a jail. The Black Death arrived in 1348, killing roughly half of Paris's population. The plague was like the world's worst party guest. Uninvited, deadly, and impossible to get rid of. It returned periodically throughout the 14th century, which really put a damper on the whole city of love vibe. By 1370, Charles V built new walls around Paris, expanding the city's boundaries because apparently bigger walls solve all problems. He also built the Bastille Fortress, which would become important later. Spoiler alert, the people eventually get very angry at that building. The 100 Years' War between France and England was exactly what it sounds like, a century of fighting over who got to be in charge. Paris changed hands a few times, with the English occupying from 1420 to 1436. Joan of Arc tried to liberate the city in 1429, but was wounded during the attempt. Paris was eventually freed in 1436, and everyone pretended the whole English occupation thing never happened, which is the most French response possible. So that's medieval Paris. Vikings, plagues, endless construction, and occupation by the English. And yet, somehow, people kept living there. That's commitment. The Renaissance arrived in Paris fashionably late, like someone showing up to brunch at 2 p.m. While Italy was having its cultural awakening in the 1400s, Paris was still recovering from the whole 100 Years' War situation. But by the early 1500s, France was ready to party Renaissance style. King Francis I, who ruled from 1515 to 1547, was basically the Renaissance equivalent of a tech billionaire. He had money, loved art, and collected Leonardo da Vinci like some people collect sneakers. He convinced Leonardo to come to France in 1516, and the artist brought along a little painting called the Mona Lisa. Yes, that Mona Lisa. So technically, France got the most famous painting in the world because a king was a really persuasive art fanboy. Francis I began transforming the Louvre from a medieval fortress into a Renaissance palace, because apparently intimidating fortress wasn't the aesthetic anymore. He demolished the old keep and started making it pretty, which is like turning a tank into a food truck. The Tuileries Palace was built starting in 1564 by Catherine de' Medici, who wanted her own place after her husband died. The palace no longer exists. It burned down in 1871, but the Tuileries Gardens remain, proving that sometimes a yard outlasts a house. In 1572, Paris hosted the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which is exactly as terrible as it sounds. What started as royal wedding celebrations between Catholic Marguerite de Valois and Protestant Henry of Navarre turned into mass violence against Protestants. Thousands were killed in Paris alone. It's a dark chapter that reminds us that religious intolerance and mob violence are never the answer, no matter how certain people are that their side is right. The French wars of religion dragged on for decades, with Paris becoming a Catholic League stronghold. Henry of Navarre, that same Protestant who survived his own wedding massacre, eventually became King Henry IV. To secure Paris, he converted to Catholicism in 1593, allegedly saying Paris is well worth a Massachusetts. This is either pragmatic politics or the most French thing ever said, probably both. Henry IV entered Paris in 1594 and worked to rebuild and beautify the city. He completed the Pont Neuf, which ironically means new bridge despite now being the oldest standing bridge across the Seine. It was finished in 1607 and was revolutionary because it was the first Paris bridge without houses built on it. Previous bridges were basically medieval strip malls over water. Henry IV also created the Place de Vosges, originally called Place Royale, starting in 1605. It's a gorgeous square with perfect symmetry and arcaded townhouses. He basically invented the elegant Parisian square, which became a template for urban design. If you ever wonder why European cities have those pretty squares, you can partially thank a French king trying to make Paris less medieval looking. The Marais district, where Place de Vosges is located, became the fashionable neighborhood. Aristocrats built elegant mansions there, transforming it from marshland. Marais literally means swamp into prime real estate. It's the ultimate urban renewal success story. In 1610, Henry IV was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic who felt the king wasn't Catholic enough, proving that you literally cannot please everyone. His widow, Marie de Medici, commissioned the Luxembourg Palace and Gardens starting in 1612, because grief in royal circles apparently requires architectural projects. The Isle St. Louis, Paris's other island, was developed starting in 1614 from two smaller islands. Developers created elegant townhouses and quays, turning muddy land into some of the most expensive real estate in the city. It's been gentrified for 400 years and counting. By 1630, Paris had recovered from the religious wars and was growing rapidly. The city was becoming what we'd recognize as Paris, beautiful, sophisticated, and expensive. The Renaissance had finally arrived, brought by kings who understood that art, architecture, and urban planning were just as important as military conquest. Well, almost as important. Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruled France for 72 years starting in 1643, which is longer than most people's careers. He was 4 years old when he became king, which explains some of his later decision-making. When you're told you're basically a god before you learn to tie your shoes, it affects your personality. In 1648, when Louis was still a child, Paris erupted in a civil war called the Fronde. The nobility and common people united against the crown, which terrified young Louis and his mother so much they had to flee the city. This experience gave Louis trust issues with Paris that lasted his entire life, like someone who had one bad Uber ride and never used the app again. Louis XIV decided the solution to Parisian rebellion was to move the entire court out of Paris to Versailles, about 12 miles away. Starting in 1661, he transformed his father's hunting lodge into the most over-the-top palace in European history. Versailles had 700 rooms, 2,000 windows, and more gold leaf than a decorative craft store. It was basically Louis saying, "I'm taking my ball and going home," except his ball was the entire French government. Despite his personal grudge against Paris, Louis did improve the city from a safe distance. In 1667, he established the first public lighting system, with thousands of lanterns lighting the streets. Paris became the city of light literally, though it would be centuries before the nickname stuck. Before this, nighttime Paris was pitch black and full of crime, like a medieval version of city with a broken power grid. Louis XIV also created the first police force in 1667 under Lieutenant General Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, because apparently street lighting alone wasn't enough to stop crime. La Rainey not only fought crime, but also improved sanitation and fire safety, making him possibly the first person to care about Paris's infrastructure. The Hôtel des Invalides was built starting in 1671 as a hospital and retirement home for wounded soldiers. It has a massive golden dome that you can see from across the city, because even military hospitals needed to be glamorous under Louis XIV. Today it houses Napoleon's tomb, but we'll get to that egomaniac later. The Comédie Française was founded in 1680 by merging Molière's former theater company with others. It's still performing today, making it the oldest active theater company in the world. That over 340 years of French people go and see plays, proving that some forms of entertainment are timeless. The Place Vendôme was designed in 1686 as an octagonal square surrounded by elegant buildings. Louis XIV originally wanted a statue of himself in the center, because humility was not his strong suit. Today it's known for luxury jewelry shops and the Ritz Hotel, maintaining its tradition of being really, really expensive. The Champs-Élysées began as an extension of the Tuileries Garden in 1667, designed by André Le Nôtre, who also designed the gardens at Versailles. It started as a tree-lined promenade and wouldn't become the grand avenue we know today until much later. In Louis XIV time, it was basically a nice place for a walk, assuming you didn't get robbed. Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, ending religious tolerance for Protestants. Hundreds of thousands of Huguenots fled France, taking their skills and wealth with them. It was economically devastating and morally wrong, proving that even the Sun King could make terrible decisions. Shocking, I know. By 1715, when Louis XIV finally died after ruling for 72 years, Paris had been transformed into a modern capital with street lighting, police, paved streets, and elegant architecture. The city's population had grown to over 500,000 people. Louis may have preferred Versailles, but his improvements made Paris livable in ways medieval Parisians could only dream about, though they probably still dreamed about better plumbing. The 18th century was when Paris became the intellectual center of Europe, which is fancy talk for saying it became the place where people argued about ideas in cafes while drinking wine. This period, called Enlightenment, was when philosophers decided that maybe, just maybe, kings weren't chosen by God and people deserved rights. The Café Procope, which opened in 1686 but hit its stride in the 1700s, became the gathering place for Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot. It was like a really pretentious Starbucks where instead of working on laptops, people worked on overthrowing the social order. The cafe is still operating today, serving coffee to tourists who probably have no idea they're sitting where the Enlightenment happened. Voltaire, the philosopher who wrote more than your most prolific group chat participant, spent time in and out of Paris. He was imprisoned in the Bastille twice and exiled repeatedly for insulting important people, which was apparently his hobby. His real name was François-Marie Arouet, but Voltaire sounds way cooler, like a philosopher superhero name. Denis Diderot edited the Encyclopédie starting in 1751, a massive project to compile all human knowledge. It took 21 years and filled 28 volumes. Today we call that Wikipedia, and it takes about 30 seconds to update. The encyclopedia was radical because it suggested that knowledge should be available to everyone, not just the elite, which was revolutionary for its time. Jean-Jacques Rousseau published The Social Contract in 1762, arguing that governments should be based on the consent of the governed. This was a wild idea when most of Europe was still ruled by absolute monarchs who believed they answered only to God. Rousseau's ideas would heavily influence the French Revolution. So, basically, he started something he didn't live to see finished. The Pantheon was originally built as a church starting in 1758, but was later converted into a mausoleum for distinguished French citizens. It's where Voltaire, Rousseau, Victor Hugo, Marie Curie, and other luminaries are buried. So it's basically France's VIP cemetery, except everyone's dead, so they can't enjoy the prestige. The Place de la Concorde was built between 1755 and 1775 as Place Louis XV, featuring a statue of the king. Later, during the Revolution, they'd remove that statue and install a guillotine instead, which is about as dramatic a renovation as you can get. The square today is elegant and peaceful, which is ironic given what happened there. The École Militaire was founded in 1750 to train officers from poor noble families. One of its most famous students was Napoleon Bonaparte, who attended in the 1780s. So you could argue that France created its own future emperor by trying to help poor noble kids. Unintended consequences are fun. The Palais Royal, renovated in the 1780s, became a center of social life with shops, cafes, and gambling houses under its arcades. It was technically royal property, which meant police couldn't enter, making it a sanctuary for illegal activities and political agitation. It was like a libertarian's dream mall. The Comédie Royale and the opera provided entertainment for Parisians who could afford it. The opera building burned down in 1763 and again in 1781, because apparently fire safety in wooden theaters full of candles don't mix well. By the late 1780s, Paris was bursting with new ideas about liberty, equality, and rational government. Philosophers had been writing about these concepts for decades. The problem was that France was essentially bankrupt from helping America win its revolution. Ironic, right? And the aristocracy refused to pay more taxes. The poor were starving, bread prices were skyrocketing, and the king seemed clueless. In short, Paris was a powder keg of Enlightenment ideals and economic desperation. All it needed was a spark. And in 1789, it got one. On July 14th, 1789, Parisians stormed the Bastille fortress, a symbol of royal tyranny. They were looking for gunpowder and weapons, but they also found only 7 prisoners, which was anticlimactic. Still, the act itself was revolutionary, literally. Today, Bastille Day is France's national holiday, celebrating the time Parisians broke into a castle because they were tired of being ignored. The Bastille was demolished almost immediately after its capture, because nothing says we're done with tyranny like tearing down a building brick by brick. Entrepreneurs sold pieces of the Bastille as souvenirs, inventing the "I stormed a fortress, and all I got was this lousy stone market." The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was adopted in August 1789, proclaiming liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression as natural rights. It's basically France's version of the Declaration of Independence, except it happened after the revolution started, not before. French people like to figure things out as they go. In October 1789, thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles to demand bread. They literally walked 12 miles because they were hungry and angry, which is a powerful combination. They forced King Louis XVI and his family to return to Paris, ending the era of Versailles as the seat of power. The king was now essentially a prisoner of Paris, the city he'd spent his life avoiding. The royal family was housed in the Tuileries Palace, where they lived under guard. Louis XVI tried to escape in 1791, getting as far as Varennes before being recognized and brought back. Running away from your job as king is generally considered bad form, and destroyed any remaining public support he had. The revolution radicalized quickly. The moderate phase gave way to radical Republicans who wanted to completely remake society. The National Convention abolished the monarchy in September 1792, and France became a republic. Louis XVI was tried for treason, found guilty, and executed by guillotine in January 1793 at the Place de la Révolution, now Place de la Concorde. His last words were an attempt to address the crowd, but the drums drowned him out. Even in death, he couldn't catch a break. The Reign of Terror began in 1793 under Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, which was ironically named considering they made everyone feel very unsafe. The guillotine at Place de la Concorde worked overtime, executing anyone suspected of being against a revolution, nobles, clergy, and eventually revolutionaries who weren't revolutionary enough. Marie Antoinette was executed in October 1793. Whether or not she actually said "let them eat cake" is debated, but either way, she lost her head. Over 2,600 people were executed in Paris alone during the Terror. The Conciergerie prison, part of the old royal palace on Isle de la Cite, became the waiting room for the guillotine. It's open for tours now, which is a bit like turning a maximum security prison into an Airbnb. Robespierre himself was eventually arrested and executed in July 1794, ending the Terror in the most predictable way possible, by becoming a victim of his own system. He was guillotined at the same spot where he'd sent so many others. The revolution had literally eaten its own children, as one contemporary observer said. The Directory governed France from 1795 to 1799, a period of relative calm and massive corruption. They moved the government to the Palais du Luxembourg and tried to stabilize France, which was exhausted from years of chaos. Paris slowly recovered, though it was scarred physically and psychologically. By 1799, Parisians were tired of instability and violence. They wanted order, security, and maybe to not worry about being guillotined for having the wrong political opinion. And a Napoleon Bonaparte, a short guy with big ambitions, and an even bigger hat, who promised to fix everything. And Parisians, desperate for stability, believed him. Napoleon Bonaparte staged a coup in November 1799, overthrowing the Directory and establishing the consulate with himself as first consul. It was technically not a monarchy, but when you have absolute power and start commissioning paintings of yourself on a rearing horse, you're basically a king in denial. Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804 at Notre Dame Cathedral. He literally took the crown from Pope Pius VII and put it on his own head, which is the ultimate power move. The message was clear. Napoleon answered to no one, not even God's representative on earth. The painting of this event by Jacques-Louis David is magnificent and features Napoleon looking dignified despite essentially throwing the world's most aggressive coronation. Napoleon loved Paris and transformed it into an imperial capital worthy of his ego, which was considerable. He commissioned the Arc de Triomphe in 1806 to celebrate his military victories. Construction began immediately, though it wouldn't be finished until 1836, long after Napoleon was dead and buried. Nothing says timeless monument like not being completed in the honored person's lifetime. The Arc de Triomphe sits at the center of the Place de l'Étoile, now called Place Charles de Gaulle, where 12 avenues radiate outward in a star pattern. It's magnificent urban planning, and also makes giving directions impossible. Take the third exit means nothing when there are 12 exits, and everyone's driving like they're in a video game. Napoleon also began work on the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel in 1806, a smaller arch near the Louvre. It was actually finished during his lifetime, in 1808, proving that smaller ambitions sometimes work better. He topped it with the famous bronze horses he'd looted from Venice, because apparently Napoleon believed in decorating through conquest. The Rue de Rivoli was built starting in 1802, named after one of Napoleon's victories. It's a long, straight street with arcaded buildings, reflecting Napoleon's love of military-style order and grandeur. He basically wanted Paris to look like an army barracks, but make it fashion. Napoleon transformed the Louvre into a museum, opening it to the public and filling it with artwork he'd acquired. And by acquired, I mean looted from across Europe. The museum was temporarily renamed Musée Napoleon, because subtle wasn't really his thing. After his defeat, much of the looted artwork was returned, but France got to keep enough to make the Louvre spectacular. The column Vendôme in Place Vendôme was built between 1806 and 1810, modeled after Trajan's column in Rome. It was made from melted-down cannons captured at the Battle of Austerlitz and features a spiral bas-relief depicting Napoleon's military campaigns. At the top was a statue of Napoleon dressed as a Roman emperor, because comparing yourself to Caesar is very normal behavior. Napoleon also improved Paris's infrastructure in practical ways. He built new bridges, improved the water supply with canals, and created new cemeteries outside the city center, like Père Lachaise, which opened in 1804. It was initially unpopular because it was too far from the city, so the government moved some famous bodies there, like Molière and La Fontaine, to make it trendy, marketing through corpse relocation. Surprisingly effective. He also built the Bourse de Commerce, improved the sewers, and created new markets. Napoleon understood that glory requires both monuments and functioning toilets. However, Napoleon's wars eventually caught up with him. After his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 and defeat at Leipzig in 1813, Paris was occupied by Allied forces in 1814. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba, an island off Italy's coast. He returned briefly in 1815 for the 100 Days, but after losing at Waterloo, he was exiled again, this time to St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Britain was taking no chances with a second comeback. Napoleon died in 1821 on St. Helena. His body was returned to Paris in 1840 and placed in a massive tomb at Les Invalides, where tourists can visit and contemplate how a Corsican artillery officer became Emperor of France and reshaped Paris forever. The tomb is ridiculously elaborate because, even in death, Napoleon required grandeur. After Napoleon, France tried various forms of government, like someone changing their relationship status on social media. There was a restoration of the monarchy, another revolution in 1830, a constitutional monarchy, another revolution in 1848, a second republic, and then Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III, became emperor. If this sounds chaotic, that's because it was the July Revolution of 1830 toppled King Charles X after he tried to roll back constitutional freedoms. Parisians built barricades in the streets and fought the army for 3 days. This Les Trois Glorieuses, the 3 glorious days, became the subject of Delacroix's painting Liberty Leading the People, which features Liberty as a woman holding a flag and showing more skin than was strictly necessary for revolutionary activities. Louis Philippe became the citizen king after the 1830 revolution, trying to be more democratic. He failed, and in 1848, another revolution kicked him out. This one established the Second Republic, which elected Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, as president. In 1851, Louis Napoleon staged a coup, and in 1852, he declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. Democracy is hard. Napoleon III hired Baron Georgy Jean Haussmann in 1853 to completely redesign Paris. Haussmann demolished medieval neighborhoods and replaced them with wide boulevards, uniform buildings, and public parks. It was the most dramatic urban renewal project in history, transforming Paris into the elegant city we know today. The wide boulevards served practical purposes: better traffic flow, improved sanitation, and sunlight reaching the streets. But they also served military purposes. Barricades are harder to build on wide streets, and armies can move more easily. Haussmann was essentially designing Paris to be both beautiful and revolution-proof. Haussmann's renovations displaced hundreds of thousands of poor Parisians, pushing them to the outer neighborhoods. The working class was literally pushed to the margins, while the boulevards became playgrounds for the wealthy. It was gentrification on a massive scale, except with more architectural consistency. The Opera Garnier was built between 1861 and 1875, designed by Charles Garnier. It's ridiculously ornate, all gold and marble and crystal chandeliers. The chandelier, by the way, famously fell in 1896, killing someone, which inspired a scene in The Phantom of the Opera. So yes, The Phantom was based on real architecture and at least one real death. Les Halles, the Central Market, was rebuilt in the 1850s with massive iron and glass pavilions. It was called the Belly of Paris by Émile Zola, which is both accurate and unappetizing. The market operated until 1971, when it was moved outside the city and replaced with shopping mall, because apparently every city eventually gets a shopping mall. The Bois de Boulogne and Bois de Vincennes parks were created on Paris's western and eastern edges, providing green spaces for Parisians. They're massive parks where people could pretend they were in the countryside while remaining firmly within city limits. The Bois de Boulogne developed a reputation for various nighttime activities, proving that even Napoleon III's careful planning couldn't control everything. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 was a disaster for France. Napoleon III was captured, the empire collapsed, and Paris was besieged by Prussian forces. During the siege, Parisians ate horses, rats, and even the animals from the zoo. The elephants from the zoo were apparently quite popular, which is either resourceful or horrifying, depending on your perspective. Paris surrendered in January 1871, and the humiliating peace terms triggered the Paris Commune, a radical socialist government that controlled the city from March to May 1871. The Communards fought against the French National Army. Yes, French against French, in street battles that destroyed parts of the city. The Tuileries Palace burned down and was never rebuilt. The Commune was eventually crushed in a bloody week where thousands were killed. The Third Republic emerged from this chaos and would last until 1940. Paris slowly recovered, And by the 1880s, the city was booming again. The wounds of the Commune faded, though the political divisions remained. France had finally found a form of government that stuck, mainly because everyone was too exhausted to fight anymore. The Belle Époque, the beautiful era, lasted from the 1880s until World War I. It was when Paris became synonymous with art, culture, and having a really good time while pretending class divisions weren't a problem. Think of it as Paris's Instagram era, except with absinthe instead of avocado toast. The Eiffel Tower was built for the 1889 World's Fair, designed by Gustave Eiffel. It was supposed to be temporary, standing for only 20 years. Many Parisians hated it, calling it a metal monstrosity and an eyesore. A group of artists and writers even published a petition against it. Today, it's the most recognizable symbol of Paris, proving that sometimes public opinion is spectacularly wrong. The tower is 330 meters tall, or was when built, and was the world's tallest structure until 1930. Eiffel had an apartment at the top where he entertained famous guests, which is the ultimate flex. Want to see my views? Let me take you to my apartment in my tower. The elevator ride was dicey, but the real estate was unbeatable. Montmartre became the center of bohemian Paris, where artists like Toulouse-Lautrec, Picasso, and Modigliani lived and worked in cheap studios. The Moulin Rouge Cabaret opened in 1889, featuring cancan dancers and a giant red windmill. It was risque entertainment for a society that pretended to be proper, but secretly enjoyed watching high kicks and exposed petticoats. The Sacre-Cœur Basilica was built atop Montmartre starting in 1875, though it wasn't completed until 1914. It was built as a symbol of penance after the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune, which is like saying sorry about the Civil War, here's a really big church. The white stone basilica gleams over Paris, visible from across the city, a constant reminder that France copes with trauma through architecture. The metro opened in 1900, just in time for the World's Fair. The first line ran from Porte de Vincennes to Port Maillot, and Parisians were skeptical about traveling underground like moles. Today, the metro is essential to Paris life, carrying millions of passengers daily through 200-plus kilometers of tunnels. The Art Nouveau station entrances designed by Hector Guimard are now beloved symbols of the city, though they were controversial when new. Apparently, every innovation in Paris must first be hated. The Grand Palais and Petit Palais were built for the 1900 World's Fair, massive exhibition halls with glass roofs and ornate decoration. The Grand Palais glass roof is so large it has its own weather system inside. It hosts art exhibitions and events, proving that Belle Époque excess can have lasting value. Artists flocked to Paris from around the world. Picasso arrived from Spain in 1900, Modigliani from Italy in 1906. The École de Paris, the School of Paris, wasn't an actual school, but a term for the international community of artists working in the city. Montparnasse became another artistic hub, with cafes like Le Dôme and La Rotonde serving as unofficial studios where artists argued about cubism over coffee. The department stores Le Bon Marché, Galeries Lafayette, Printemps, became palaces of consumer culture with their grand architecture and vast selections. Shopping became entertainment, and window displays became art. Galeries Lafayette's Art Nouveau Dome, completed in 1912, is stunning and makes buying overpriced scarves feel like a cultural experience. The Paris suburbs began expanding rapidly as industry grew and workers needed housing. The banlieues developed their own character, separate from central Paris, a division that would have lasting social implications. Not everyone could afford Haussmann's elegant boulevards. By 1914, Paris was at its peak, beautiful, cultured, confident, and wealthy. It was a city everyone wanted to visit, the center of art and fashion. The Belle Époque was living up to its name. And then World War I started and everything changed. World War I lasted from 1914 to 1918 and killed over 1.3 million French soldiers. Paris itself wasn't occupied, but it was bombed and shelled. The closest the Germans came was just 40 kilometers away at the First Battle of the Marne in 1914. Taxis from Paris were famously requisitioned to rush French troops to the front, because apparently, even in existential crises, France still had style. 600 taxis saved Paris, which is either heroic or proof that Uber should have existed earlier. After the war, Paris became the destination for the lost generation of American writers and artists. Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, and others lived in Paris in the 1920s, drinking at cafes, writing novels, and being dramatically disillusioned. Hemingway's A Movable Feast romanticized this era, though he wrote it decades later, proving that nostalgia makes everything better. The 1920s and 30s were Paris's jazz age. Josephine Baker performed at the Folies Bergerac, becoming a sensation while wearing a costume made of bananas, which was somehow both scandalous and beloved. Jazz clubs flourished, and Paris offered Black American artists a freedom they couldn't find a home. The city's reputation for artistic liberty wasn't just marketing. It was real. The 1931 Colonial Exhibition in the Bois de Vincennes showcased France's empire in a way that seems deeply problematic today. It was basically imperialism as theme park, complete with recreated villages and exotic performances. The Palais de la Porte Dorée remains from this exhibition, now housing an immigration museum, which is either ironic or appropriate, depending on how you look at it. World War II brought occupation. The Nazis entered Paris on June 14, 1940, and would remain until August 1944. Hitler visited Paris once, at dawn, doing a quick tour of monuments. There's a famous photo of him at the Eiffel Tower, looking pleased with himself. The occupation was brutal. Jews were rounded up, resistance fighters were executed, and Paris was stripped of resources and art. The Vel d'Hiv roundup in July 1942 saw French police arrest over 13,000 Jews, including children, who were held at a cycling stadium before being deported to Auschwitz. France's collaboration with Nazi Germany is a dark chapter that wasn't fully acknowledged until the 1990s. For decades, the official story emphasized resistance while ignoring collaboration. Confronting uncomfortable truths takes time, apparently. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 was led by the French 2nd Armored Division under General Leclerc, with support from the American 4th Infantry Division. General von Colditz, the German commander, disobeyed Hitler's order to destroy Paris, surrendering instead. Whether this was mercy or pragmatism is debated, but either way, Paris survived mostly intact. General de Gaulle led a victory parade down the Champs-Élysées on August 26, 1944, cementing his status as France's liberator and future leader. Post-war Paris faced housing shortages and needed reconstruction. The Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years from 1945 to 1975, saw economic growth and modernization. The suburbs expanded dramatically with new housing projects, creating the banlieues as we know them today. Not all development was beautiful, and some would argue the suburbs got the short end of the urban planning stick. May 1968 brought student protests and general strikes that nearly toppled the government. Students occupied the Sorbonne, workers occupied factories, and Paris was paralyzed. The protests started over university regulations but expanded to question society, capitalism, and authority itself. It was a revolution that didn't quite revolutionize, but it changed French culture permanently. The slogan, "It is forbidden to forbid," summed up the spirit, rebellious, idealistic, and paradoxical. The Pompidou Center opened in 1977, designed by Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers. It looks like a building turned inside out, with all the pipes, ducts, and escalators on the exterior in bright colors. Parisians initially hated it. Seeing a pattern here? But it's now beloved. It houses modern art and has welcomed millions of visitors, proving that radical architecture can work if you give it 20 years. President Mitterrand's grand projets in the 1980s and 90s transformed Paris again. The Louvre Pyramid, designed by IMP and completed in 1989, was controversial, yes, again, but became iconic. The Musée d'Orsay opened in 1986 in a converted train station, housing Impressionist art. The Opera Bastille opened in 1989 on the site of the old Bastille prison, bringing opera to the people, or at least the people who could afford opera tickets. The Grande Arche de la Défense was completed in 1989 in the business district west of Paris. It's a modern arch that aligns with the Arc de Triomphe and the Champs-Élysées, extending the historic axis into the 20th century. It's essentially Napoleon's Arc de Triomphe, but for the corporate age, less bronze horses, more office buildings. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France, with its distinctive four-tower design, opened in 1995. It looks like four open books, which is either clever symbolism or someone who ran out of ideas. Either way, it's striking and houses millions of books, so it serves its purpose. Paris today is a living museum, a functioning city of over 2 million people in the city proper and 12 million in the metropolitan area. It's constantly balancing preservation with progress, history with modernity. The same debates that occurred over the Eiffel Tower and Pompidou Center continue with every new project. The city faces contemporary challenges: housing costs, social inequality, integration of immigrant communities, terrorism, and climate change. The 2015 attacks on the Bataclan and other locations shocked the city, but Parisians responded with resilience. The Notre Dame fire in 2019 devastated the city emotionally, but reconstruction is underway, scheduled for completion in 2024. Paris hosted the Olympics in 2024, its third time hosting, after 1924, bringing the world to the city once again. The Seine is being cleaned for swimming, showing that even ancient rivers can be renewed. From a Celtic fishing village to a Roman outpost to a medieval capital to an imperial city to a modern metropolis, Paris has been continuously inhabited and continuously reinvented for over 2,000 years. It's been conquered, liberated, revolutionized, modernized, and commercialized. It's been both glorified and criticized, loved and hated, often simultaneously. And through it all, Paris remains Paris. Beautiful, frustrating, inspiring, and expensive. It's a city that believes in its own importance and somehow convinced the world to agree. It's where history lives alongside the present, where you can walk medieval streets while checking your phone, where the past isn't dead. It's not even past, as Faulkner would say, though he was talking about the American South, not Paris. But the principle holds. Paris is its history. Every street, every building, every bridge carries stories of the millions who lived, loved, fought, created, and died there. And now you know those stories. Or at least 100 of them. Welcome to Paris. Thanks for staying awake this long. Now you can finally sleep.